All of the discourse surrounding the show is strange to me. Usually when someone brings up Akame got killed, they talk about the anime original ending or about how the manga's ending was just as bad, at least back when the series was still somewhat relevant. And while I don't necessarily disagree with those statements, I never thought that the main problems with the anime specifically stemmed from the ending. If I could be completely honest with you, the truth is, Akame got killed was never that great. The whole thing with this show is introducing a likable cast of characters and then killing them off to get a sad reaction out of the audience, but the show kind of completely forgets to make these characters likable or interact with each other in any meaningful way. Take Bulat for example. When Tatsumi first trains with him, he seems pretty cool, very strong and nice to the main character in a setting that he feels uncomfortable in at first. Tatsumi even calls him bro, and because of their first interaction, you'd expect them to be really close and always be seen together, and then Tatsumi unconsciously decides to shun him until the day he dies. They try to make Bulat's death really emotional, like Tatsumi's really hurting over the loss of one of his closest friends, but outside of the episode they first talk to each other in, there's nothing about that relationship that makes this dramatic beat work. They barely talk to each other outside of training and work-related shit, which makes it seem like they're more or less just co-workers. There's this painful divide between how they view each other and how they act towards each other, and not in a way that feels intentional. It honestly comes off as the writer thoughtlessly putting in these scenes to desperately raise the amount of on-screen interaction they have with each other before they kill them off. That's generally how it feels for all of the character deaths. The first few episodes give Tatsumi the chance to fully get to know each of the members of Night Raid, the group of assassins he joins at the end of the first episode, and most of the members are given their own episode to give the audience a good idea of who they are, or half an episode in some cases, but we'll get to that. But instead of just having him bounce off of the colorful personalities that make up the rest of the main cast and endearing me to their characters, the show decides to place focus on these awful flashbacks about these people's somber backstories. It's so in your face about it, and the show is practically telling you, look at this depressing flashback, isn't it so unjust and unfair and cruel, and don't you feel so bad for the character? They aren't that well directed, they're very clumsy, and honestly, the extremity of some of these situations just completely disillusioned me while I was first watching. If that was the only problem, I'd say, okay, whatever, this anime doesn't have the best approach to that specific aspect of character building, but I can still enjoy it. I can still like these characters as long as these episodes have a strong focus. They do not. Like, look at Shield, and the episode that should be dedicated to the development of her relationship with Tatsumi, the show keeps jumping around at different topics that don't reinforce the pathos of the story, and after a certain point in the episode, they actually stop having any kind of interaction in favor of moving on to the next story beat and giving the remainder of her time to another character instead. The problem is, the heart of the story relies on these big moments of the characters dying, but the show fails to properly build these moments up in a way that's effective. I'm focusing on Shield because she's by far the worst example of this. There's somehow even less build up to her death than there is with Bulat. At least with Bulat, the show gave us some kind of information that makes his death on paper seem like an interesting moment. Tatsumi sees him as an older brother, he spends a lot of time with him, even if the time he does spend with him and the dialogue exchanges they do have is some of the blandest shit ever. So that equates to him being very sad when he dies. Cool, but when they were writing in Shield, they couldn't even be bothered to handle her as lazily as the other characters. Shield, from my memory at least, does one nice thing for the main character and dies pretty much immediately after. She's comforting him after he comes to terms with the death of his friends for the 4th time in a row, since the writers can't help but reuse this plot point that was never that good to begin with, and this is the only thing that happens between the two of them that marks their relationship as very important, and then, like I said before, she dies immediately after this, and Tatsumi makes this really big deal out of it as if she was a really good friend. So she got your dick hard once, cry me a fucking river. Imagine if Final Fantasy VII made Jesse's death this big deal and Cloud was there talking to her and they portrayed it in a way that was completely overblown considering her role in the story. That would be fucking stupid, right? Another aspect of these characters is that they don't feel fully realized or the best planned out. What I'm saying is, it doesn't feel like the writers had a solid plan for any of these characters really, and you can maybe blame that on the anime original ending and how it cut the story short, but even the canon stuff is sloppily handled, and not in a way that seems like the adaptation's fault. For example, Mine, for a character who's supposed to be the love interest for the protagonist, she sure doesn't share a lot of moments with the guy. I could kind of see them together in the 3rd episode, but between that and the moment where she's confirmed to have feelings for him, there's just nothing that happens with them that makes me buy that. So this development ends up coming out of nowhere and just makes me angry with the pure incompetence being put on display instead of actually caring about the fact that she dies. You can't just have these two not interact with each other in a way that's meaningful, at least, for 15 whole ass episodes and then try to slap a band-aid on this problem by having a random ass priest walk up to them and say, hey, you two should totally fuck, and then all of a sudden now they start seeing each other in a non-platonic way. I get that Tatsumi saves Mine from dying at the end of episode 19, but this still feels like it comes out of nowhere because of how randomly randomly they decide to focus on this part of the show. It wasn't something that was always present in the show. It's like the writers just made these characters start feeling this way because, well, he just wanted to. Those are the most notable ones I wanted to talk about, but the other characters weren't handled that well either. Rapid fire mode on. Tatsumi is a very bland and forgettable main character, and the only thing I found interesting about him was the fact that he got used to killing people pretty early on, and the show didn't just make him someone who's useless until the final episode. Leone is the least focused on character, and her death is very unnecessary. It randomly happens at the end of the show to try to make the ending seem more deep and interesting, but it didn't come off that way because it was just ultimately pointless. Susanoo's relationship with the rest of the cast was very forced, and I didn't care for his death. That's all I have to really say about the guy. He's so fucking boring that I can't even think of anything else to talk about in regards to him. The only character deaths I found myself caring about were Chelsea's and Lobot, but that's not because of their connections to the main character and the rest of the cast. In fact, I think those aspects of their characters are the weakest things about them. The reason I liked them was because they were really competent. They were good at their jobs and used their abilities in cool and interesting ways. So to see them go was sad because their competence made them a hell of a lot more likable than the rest of the cast. But the character that really grinds my gears is Akame. You'd expect from all the posters where she's very prevalent in the artwork and OPs and EDs where she's very heavily emphasized, and the fucking title, Akame ga Kill, that Akame would probably be maybe the most important character in the show, right? Well, she's actually in contention for being the most irrelevant character ever. Maybe this is different in the manga, but there's no real reason for the anime to be called Akame ga Kill, except for the fact that she's the only character who wasn't killed off in some incredibly stupid and ham-fisted way. And the reason why this makes me so mad is that I think she's actually a pretty solid character. The few episodes that revolve around her and her sister have the best drama that the show has to offer, although I don't know how much of a compliment that is. She's likable and has some genuinely fun interactions with the main character, and she's just entertaining to watch in general. Episode 4 is the best episode of the show by far, and that's only because of the very simple but very effective way it reveals certain things about Akame's character and her motives. Akame's fight with Zonk is superbly directed, and one of the few moments I got thoroughly invested in what was happening. But that doesn't matter. None of that matters, because the show never stops treating Akame like the B-plot of the anime, the thing that's never the main focus. It's just the side story that gets wrapped up all on its own in a way that feels almost entirely disconnected from everything else, and that bothers me. At the end, she gets into a pretty cool fight with Esdeath to fully wrap things up, but I just wish she was more utilized. Speaking of Esdeath though, like, what a letdown, am I right? They spend so much time talking her up and saying she's such a powerful character, she's too dangerous to deal with, and she might even be the most powerful person in the whole universe or whatever, but she spends pretty much the entire show doing nothing except for like 2 things. I think what happened with this character is that she was written to be really powerful, but that backfired because they were too scared to make any kind of meaningful confrontation between her and the main characters, because the audience might call bullshit whenever she just wouldn't completely obliterate them, so yeah, they pretty much just fucked themselves in the ass with that one. Aside from all of those other problems, Night Raid as a group is just severely lacking in any kind of genuine sense of camaraderie or coziness that you would expect from a place where Tatsumi can feel at home. It's the only place that's treated him fairly since he left his actual home, and I can't relate to the feeling. The base is barren as hell, and the way these characters interact with each other are really milquetoast and generic. There's seriously like no energy with this group. They really do feel like a bunch of acquaintances who barely even know each other. As if the show wasn't struggling with balancing all of these characters already, they decide to introduce 2 more after a certain point in the anime, which ends up screwing over the rest of the cast even more by making everything seem more unfocused. This show is just messy. Like, that's all I have to say about it. It can't pick one thing to focus on. It can't even pick a character to focus on for the most part. And when the cast comes together, it's often just as forgettable as the individual characters are. I've been pretty harsh on this show, but I don't think it's awful. If anything, I'd say it's just mediocre. However, there is one other thing I want to talk about. Something else that a lot of people say about this show is that it's really edgy, but I honestly can't relate to that. There are definitely edgy moments. For example, this girl's whole character is just concentrated edge with the side of redundancy, but for a majority of these moments, it does feel like a sincere attempt at making the audience feel for the characters and not in just some edgelord, depressing kind of way. Just because a lot of characters die, that doesn't make the show edgy. A lot of the time, the characters' deaths actually have a hopeful connotation to them, even the ones that are really unnecessary. And looking at some of the shit that happened in these final episodes, I just don't understand why the show was labeled in that kind of way. But it's still bad, that's all, and I'll be going now.